Hello everyone, it's Professor Luong, and today we will be talking about rangeland wildlife management. So just to review some of the key points on rangeland management on wildlife that we left off on last time, rangelands have high potential for supporting species-rich wildlife and insect communities. There are non-native and invasive wildlife that can affect rangelands, but there's also native wildlife that can become overpopulated, leading to grazing competition and other human-wildlife conflicts. Natural predators can help keep ecosystem balance, but can also cause human-wildlife conflict. And human-wildlife conflict is a very nuanced but major issue in rangeland management that can cause major divisions between groups of people that can affect funding and political support as well as resource levels. So rangelands, of course, support wildlife biodiversity. Globally, rangelands are very diverse. There's many different types of rangeland types because of the diversity of climates and soils and combinations of those that exist across the globe. And rangelands are estimated to encompass at least 50 up to 70% of the Earth's terrestrial surface. And so this has a high potential because it's such a large area and such a diverse habitat to support vast amounts of biodiversity, including species-rich wildlife communities. Rangeland diversity and heterogeneity on rangelands create this diverse habitat, as I mentioned, with diverse habitat structures, leading to diverse wildlife communities. And wildlife, similar to plants, are affected by physical characteristics in existing biological communities, such as vegetation, microbial communities, and other animal communities, which can lead to the evolution of unique wildlife communities and unique wildlife species that may still exhibit similar traits based on similar physical characteristics, based on the physical characteristics they developed under. So rangelands provide habitat also for special status wildlife, which can be especially important. In the US, rangelands provide habitat for over 3,000 wildlife species. That's mostly not including insects. And so that might be mammals, birds, herps, and reptiles. And rangelands support several special status species across the United States. In California specifically, an example from Santa Cruz is the coastal prairies there have endangered Ohlone tiger beetle. And oftentimes we actually use cattle grazing as a management practice to help support the endangered Ohlone tiger beetle because it needs open habitat and bare ground in order to burrow and reproduce. In Oklahoma, another example is in oak savannas and with mixed grass prairies, which are really important to supporting other special status species like the whooping crane and the American burying beetle. In New Mexico, desert ranges are important for protecting special status bighorn sheep, as well as other areas in the Rockies. And recent efforts have also shown that there have been successful efforts to restore lots of different wildlife species, although sometimes they can be complicated and can result in human-wildlife conflicts. Wildlife and insect species also support rangelands and nearby ecosystem services. Wildlife recreation, for example, can be a large part of the rangeland economy in certain areas, especially in the Midwest and the American West, where the Bureau of Land Management has a lot of land and supports a lot of recreation. Native wildlife at healthy population levels provide important support for ecosystem functioning by supporting biomass removal, promoting seed dispersal of important species, and creating habitat heterogeneity, as well as several other functions that we won't go into detail right now. Rangeland insect populations can also support pollinator and pest control services or natural enemy services for nearby agriculture, as well as rangeland plant communities and nearby rural gardens. And some keystone species like wolves and beavers can also massively transform their environments through trophic cascades or physically through damming and removal and movement of biomass that can really affect and transform ecosystem management and rangeland properties. For example, we'll go through an example with beavers right now in rangelands. And ranchers actually, from a recent study, found that ranchers actually perceive greater benefits from beavers than risk. And if you didn't know, beavers are called Castor canadensis. Beavers can help provide water sources and improve riparian health and productivity of the riparian area, as well as nearby upland area, by indirectly increasing the water table and supporting greater vegetation growth. Beaver activity can also support a lot of other wildlife species, providing and building habitat, creating water holes and water sources for different wildlife, as well as livestock species. And with proper grazing management, livestock grazing is compatible with beaver introduction, co-management, and restoration efforts. But oftentimes, these grazing practices require some fencing and protection of the riparian area, which the beavers need a little bit more space in. But of course, beavers can sometimes affect ranching operations as well and reduce the amount of area available for grazing or livestock production, and essentially raise the water table so much and create perennial wetlands in certain areas, removing it from livestock production. And so there have been some management practices that can be used, and most of the time it's removal and hunting. Beavers used to be endangered, but they have been restored and their population levels have recovered to near original levels. And so hunting and taking of beavers are allowed in most states, with a few exceptions, namely Oregon. But in most big western states like California, Texas, and etc., taking of beavers is a perfectly acceptable management practice. We also have bison, or bison as its common name, in the American West. And they are the largest extant means the kind of existing, non-extinct in an area. The largest extant animal in North America, but they only occupy 1.2% of their original range from pre-colonial times. Bison are important because they can promote habitat heterogeneity and compensatory growth and higher plant diversity in the rangelands they occupy. And that's because they often have grazing and wallowing behavior, but they don't stay in the same place. And they often also have seasonal migration patterns, which follow forage availability, which reduce issues with overgrazing, as well as pest and disease accumulation in a rangeland. And oftentimes they can coexist with cattle with proper management practices, and populations are currently stable after reintroduction efforts, although, like I mentioned, they only occupy 1.2% of their original range. And we expect there will be future risks to bison from climate change that might reduce forage availability and increase heat stress for the animals. Native wildlife populations, however, can also be detrimental to rangeland health, especially if uncontrolled. Native wildlife can be detrimental, especially when is overpopulation of wildlife grazers, which results in overgrazing, competition with livestock, and reduction of soil health by increasing erosion and soil compaction, and resulting in vegetation turnover, sometimes to less desirable native or less desirable forage species. And wildlife grazers can often, though, unfortunately, become easily overpopulated in many areas due to a lack of natural predators that were previously removed with past land management federal policies. But certain areas are recovering predator populations or reintroducing and restoring predator populations, and are starting to see declines in overabundant herbivore native wildlife populations causing potential issues with overgrazing or competition with livestock by reducing deer populations, and so on. However, another issue is native wildlife, especially in high abundance, especially in high density, can really promote spread of diseases and pathogens, parasites, to humans and to livestock. And then we also have iconic but feral and non-native wildlife species that you may be familiar with, or maybe you don't know that they're actually non-native, and they pose serious risks to rangeland health. And these include feral horses and wild burros, or donkeys. And so they are actually wild horses, and they're descendants of non-native horses bred and brought by Europeans. And although we did used to have native horses, they went extinct about 10,000 years ago. These horses often escaped from captivity, or were released and became feral, and now cause major issues with rangeland degradation. They can become aggressive with other wildlife and with other livestock animals. Often they're competitive grazers, driving animals away from forage. Also cause a lot of erosion, especially with issues with overgrazing. They're one of the more destructive grazers in terms of the impact they leave on the land. They really cause a lot of issues with watering holes. They're also competitive at watering holes, and they bogard them and try to prevent other animals and wildlife from using watering holes. They can also negatively affect bird and herp richness and abundance. Herps are reptiles essentially, because they cause rangeland degradation, destroy vegetation and habitat. It can really be a major issue. And again, there's also a major issue because they lack natural predators. They have high fecundity. And then there's also, unfortunately, federal policies like the Wild Horse Protection Act of 1959 and of 1971, that actually prevent any type of hunting or damage to wild horse or burro populations. And so this is a major management issue, both for livestock producers and wildlife managers and conservationists, and so they all agree on this issue. And so you can think of the meme of where people are holding hands and flexing, and that's where they all get along. And so the management of feral horses and burros is complicated by federal policies that protect these populations. But there have been efforts to determine and figure out management for these species. And first, that requires determining the appropriate management levels and figuring out how many horses or burros this rangeland can support sustainably. And this is often done by collecting 3 to 5 years of data on the herd size in what we call a herd management area. And this is data related to the vegetation, soils, bare ground, erosion, climate, water quality, and many other factors as well. And with that, we determine an appropriate management level or maximum and minimum population size you might expect is sustainable for these populations on a rangeland. And then now, with recent policies, there's some programs that, through the Bureau of Land Management, that can be used to help manage these species. And so in 1978, there was Adopt a Wild Horse program, where BLM rounds up wild horses and has horse auctions to try to reduce rangeland populations of them. Because of the quick overpopulation after the 1971 Protection Act, there was a new act in 1976 called the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, which allowed for helicopter roundups based on appropriate management levels and culling of individuals in horse or burro herds. And then they've also implemented fertility control programs where they essentially use this vaccine, so to speak, that sterilizes horses and burros, called Zonostat or PZP. And these can work, but oftentimes are not feasible for large herds. because they're only effective for 1 to 2 years and then they have to be treated again. And so that requires a lot of labor and effort, potentially going around and darting with dart guns these horses, and then it's hard to track which ones have been darted and not. And so even though it can work, it has a lot of limitations currently. Feral pigs are another major issue, non-native to rangelands, and they were originally brought as domestic livestock by Europeans in the 1700s, and then bred with released European wild boars in Monterey in the 1920s. And the descendants of those two livestock breds brought over from Europe have created this feral wild pig that is a non-native hybrid that is widespread and problematic across the North American rangelands and agricultural areas. There are major issues for a lot of reasons, including zoonotic diseases. And so they transmit 30 plus diseases to other wildlife, and about 20 of those are human transmissible. They degrade rangelands through a lot of different behaviors that we call rooting, wallowing, foraging, and hunting. And annually, we estimate that they cause $1.5 billion of damage to rangeland ecosystem services as well as agricultural crop production. And if you're unfamiliar, feral pigs have a taxonomic name of Sus scrofa. Feral pigs exhibit behaviors, like I mentioned, that cause damage to rangelands, such as rooting. Rooting is overtilling and turning of the soil, exposing bare soils and uprooting plants, affecting riparian areas, creating bare ground for plant invasions, and disrupting existing vegetation, decreasing forage availability through plant mortality, and also affecting sensitive plants. This can also cause massive damage to agricultural fields as well as home gardens. They also exhibit wallowing behavior similar to bison, except they don't migrate and they stay in the same areas and continue to disrupt them, causing major issues with water supplies, especially natural seeps and springs, decreasing water quality, and also increasing the survivability of fecal coliform, which can promote rangeland different types of zoonotic diseases by increasing water turbidity. They also negatively affect habitat for wildlife by, again, decreasing available habitat with their rooting and wallowing behavior. They're also aggressive and can drive, similar to feral horses, other animals away from forage and from water areas. They're really competitive foragers, and they compete with wildlife and livestock for grass and others in space. And often they kill and hunt young livestock animals as well as sensitive wildlife species that we might care about protecting. They also affect native wildlife and vegetation, as I alluded to, and we know feral pigs, for example, can decrease oak regeneration due to rooting behavior, wallowing behavior, and an affinity for eating oak acorns. They kill endangered species and sensitive species like the cute Channel Island fox you can see over there, as well as many different types of upland birds, small mammals like weasels, and they can kill other types of foxes on the mainland and other types of small mammals, native mammals as well. They destroy habitat, they eat and sometimes just wallow and destroy bird eggs. They have a lot of dietary overlap with wildlife species like bears and deers, often can be aggressive and drive deer away from water. And they also can try to drive cattle and take their supplements. So to manage feral swine, oftentimes we conduct small-scale exclusion and trapping, which are often very effective, but are small scale. And across the larger scales, it can be a bit harder to implement because pigs can be destructive with fencing and often break out of large-scale exclusions. Oftentimes, there's recreational hunting and agency culling to help manage pigs and feral swine. And oftentimes, though, you do require a permanent tag, but it's not that difficult to acquire. You can get depredation tags for pigs that have affected your livestock or your any type of operation. You can also get tags for removing any untagged free-roaming pigs that may be domestic livestock before they become feral. However, the use of toxicants and oral contraceptives are banned as a feral swine management method because of potential unintended consequences and effects on wildlife and livestock species and domestic pets. Rangeland predators are really important for keeping nuisance species from establishing, as well as limiting overpopulation of non-livestock wildlife. And when I say nuisance species, I say things like pigs. Predators like wolves can cause what we call trophic cascades. So they're at a top, or they're apex predator, they're at the top of a trophic food web, and basically their interactions cause cascading effects down the entire food chain. And so, for example, deer may be overgrazing riparian areas and preventing riparian bank stabilization, limiting proper population support for healthy riparian areas and those habitats that support diverse wildlife communities, bird communities, insect communities, and so on. Wolves, when introduced, may then limit those deer, prevent overpopulation and overbrowsing of these riparian areas, allowing for these riparian willows essentially to stabilize, establish a healthy riparian area and support additional wildlife species, create positive feedback cycles that allow for the return of beavers and further improve productivity of a region, as well as habitat heterogeneity and wildlife habitat. They can also be important for reducing wildlife and livestock disease transmission because they can reduce the population density. And the more dense a population is of livestock or wildlife that share common diseases, the more likely it is to spread. And so you could just think of a room full of people. If we have our classroom, which is normally 20 people, jam-packed with 50 people, you're definitely more likely to breathe someone's nasty air and get sick from it if they're sick. Or if the room only has 5 people, you're most likely not going to share as much air and less likely to pass on this transmission. And this same kind of idea applies across an entire rangeland as well. And they can also cause depredation, sometimes of livestock, of course, causing human-wildlife conflict, but they can also depredate competitive grazers that may be affecting grazing competition with cattle, like elk species. But of course, like I mentioned, predators have complicated human-wildlife interactions and risks. So next we'll be finishing up by talking about human-wildlife conflict. And the first one is grazing competition for resources. And so some rangeland wildlife act as direct competitors for forage or browse because they have dietary overlap with our livestock animals, whether they be cattle, sheep, or goats, or some other obscure livestock class and breed. And so, for example, locally, we have issues with Aleutian cackling geese and elk that compete with cattle and graze grass pretty heavily. And more widely speaking, we have issues with feral pigs that can compete and destroy rangeland habitat. Oftentimes, and this essentially can lead to reduced forage availability and essentially result in less animal gains per day in livestock production or in dairy production, although again, don't generally produce dairy on rangelands, and may also require additional resource investment into hay or other types of feed or supplements that now may be missing from your livestock's diet. It may also require additional resources to implement more intensive grazing plans to protect rangeland health and to prevent overgrazing with competitive grazers and reduced vegetation and increased bare ground. It also can cause direct interactions and competition, negative interactions that cause animal stress, reducing livestock health, especially with certain species like feral pigs and horses. And livestock can also decrease wildlife abundance and diversity as well, depending on management practices. In terms of diseases, some wildlife serve as reservoirs and vectors for pests, diseases, and parasites, and can spread these both to livestock and vice versa, as well as to humans. And so examples of ones that can easily spread to humans, of course, are rabies, ticks, and brucellosis, which is a bacterial infection. They can also cause and affect livestock production and wildlife animal, and can require culling or euthanization, and can also, if not, reduce animal gains per day, reducing overall profit. It can require medicine and could reduce or remove an animal from production if it's organic, or just require additional resources. And this can also be larger issues in other geographical areas that have wildlife species that are more closely related to livestock species, such as in African savannas. And then, of course, there are predators, and those are, of course, very controversial, and that's because they cause direct depredation of livestock and sometimes humans, and also human injury. And carnivores can do this thing where they create a landscape of fear for their prey, which can also affect prey behavior, limit their mobility and where they forage, can also sometimes cause livestock stress and decrease animal gains, again, decreasing overall profit. But some folks have thought of creative ways to manipulate these landscape of fears, to manipulate and shape livestock behaviors, to reduce human wildlife conflict and issues with depredation, and coexist with predator populations, because like we discussed before, predators are important to maintain balance in many other ways that can be supplementary or can be coexisting and sometimes even beneficial for livestock management. Because sometimes it increases livestock gains by decreasing competition or transmissible diseases. And oftentimes, of course, lethal control is a potential management method, but that can have consequences depending on the surrounding context, and population dynamics and size. And oftentimes, this can promote competition of less experienced and more predators in a new territory. And so let's just say we have an area, let's just say Cook Island, for example, Cock Robin Island, for example, in Lolita, has a pack of coyotes. They are established, they have their territory. If you remove them, another pack will likely come in, and that pack may be competing with a different pack to establish in that territory, resulting in greater conflict and greater issues with wildlife or human conflict. As mentioned in our guest field trip, sometimes hunting livestock for certain types of predators like coyotes can be learned behaviors. Certain packs don't know this. If you remove a pack that doesn't have this learned behavior, it can be replaced by a pack that is experienced with livestock hunting. And so it's really important to think about potential issues with lethal control, and if there are other potential ways we can manage for this, such as manipulating livestock behaviors with this landscape of fear, or thinking of non-lethal methods like potential coyote sterilization efforts and other predator sterilization efforts. And it's really important to really understand, or at least understand the context behind human wildlife conflicts, because rangelands are not just ecological system, and I want you guys to remember that rangelands are ecological, but they're also a social system that include people, that include economics, that include policy and politics. And you can't really fully understand what happens on a rangeland without understanding some of these social factors. Because you can always measure the vegetation, you can always measure the animals, you can even measure the livestock and understand their gains and how it changes the vegetation, and the soils and the soil health. But you're ultimately, without understanding why these management practices are being undertaken, or the economies that drive them, or the political pressures that force or limit them, you're not going to fully understand rangeland ecosystems or ecology. And just an example here, we know that rangelands are top economic sectors in many different areas, including including California and Texas, where dairy products are the top in California, and rangeland products like cattle and calves are the third top grossing agricultural product. Whereas in Texas, cattle is the top grossing um, agricultural product. And so, respectively, in California, with dairy and cattle calf products, that's about 14 billion. In Texas, that's about 15 billion. And you can also see, compared to the rest of the world, California and Texas are the fifth and ninth top economy in the world. And so understanding the context of some of these political landscapes, economic landscapes, are also going to be important because they're going to be driving factors that affect rangeland management policies and thereby ecology. Local community perceptions also affect wildlife management, especially with those that have heavy livestock or human interactions, because they affect livelihoods. They affect people's lives, families, whether or not they're going to be hungry, how they're going to survive and live. So it's a really important topic to think about and remember, because we have to think people still have to survive, and we have to figure out a way management practices that works for everyone to coexist. And again, this is important for some of these. You can see the stats here because rangelands support top producing economic sectors in top world economies. And that's it for today. See you soon.